Hey everybody, Mr. Philip Campbell here. This is lecture 11 in my honors course series of lectures on modern American history covering the 1980s. And I want to talk about something that I only spent one slide on in the PowerPoint presentation, which is the American invasion of Grenada in 1983. Grenada is a Caribbean island. It's in the south of the Caribbean, just north of Trinidad, kind of off the coast of Venezuela, and it's a very tiny island, normally would be very inconsequential to the United States. But in 1969, a Marxist regime took power in Grenada under the control of a dictator named Maurice Bishop. And Bishop, once in power, began trying to cultivate relations with Cuba, which of course was the largest communist power in the Caribbean and an enemy of the United States. And had been ever since the Cuban Missile Crisis. This naturally raised the eyes of Washington and the new administration of President Ronald Reagan, who was coming in 1980. Things deteriorated in 1983 when Maurice Bishop was assassinated and two rival factions of Marxists began vying for control in Grenada. There was protests and all sorts of civil unrest in the country. Now, this greatly concerned the U.S. government because there were 1,000 U.S. citizens living in Grenada, many of them attending a prestigious medical school there. So the government was kind of monitoring the situation in Grenada as the unrest spiraled out of control and descended into actual civil war. President Reagan made the call to deploy 2,000 U.S. troops to Grenada for the purpose of protecting U.S. citizens and property on the island. Not to get involved in the war, but just to protect U.S. interests. However, once United States troops arrived, they found that they were strongly opposed by members of the Grenadan military and also by the Cuban military engineers who were there working on the expanding and modernizing the airport of Grenada. And so the United States soldiers found themselves in a pretty intense firefight once they got to Grenada, and Reagan ended up ordering another 4,000 troops there to back up the original 2,000. So the U.S. deployment was raised to over 6,000 soldiers, and they were supposed to quell the violence and fend off the attacks of the Grenadan armed forces. The operation lasted 4 days. Of course, the United States won. The little island of Grenada is not going to stand up to the United States. The invasion was very popular in the United States. Only 19 Americans were killed. 60 plus members of the Grenadan armed forces were killed. And but more importantly, the Marxist regime collapsed entirely, and it was replaced with a government that was friendly to the United States. So this was a huge diplomatic and military victory for the USA. President Reagan claimed that this was the first successful rollback of a communist government since the outset of the Cold War. It was very popular in Grenada, too. To this day, the Grenadans celebrate the date of the invasion as a Thanksgiving Day. And why not? It deposed a communist dictator and freed many political prisoners and restored democratic elections. So they celebrated on Grenada as Thanksgiving Day. However, the United Nations condemned the U.S. invasion. They called it, quote, a flagrant violation of international law. And in a vote of 108 to 9, they voted to condemn the United States action. Basically, they saw this as a modern application of the old and by then discredited Roosevelt corollary that the United States basically got liberty to act as a police force all around the Caribbean. Because although Reagan went down there to protect U.S. interests, protect U.S. property and citizens, what ended up happening was we effectively overthrew the government of Grenada and put in a pro-U.S. government, which is basically the Roosevelt corollary. We're going to protect our interests down there and intervene whenever we want. So, yeah, you can see it. You can see it various ways. Was it a victorious, patriotic blow against communism and despotism in the Caribbean? It certainly was. Was it also another example of the United States playing police around Latin America and just having our way in the backyard of our southern neighbors? You could argue that as well. Hey, speaking of Ronald Reagan, also want to talk about the idea of Reaganomics. Reaganomics refers to the economic policies of President Ronald Reagan. And these were the policies that he implemented in response to the stagflation of the 1970s. And there's a couple pillars to Reaganomics: large tax cuts, especially for businesses; decreased spending on social programs such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, etc.; increased military spending; and deregulation of domestic businesses. And Reaganomics, by the way, this is a name that was applied to Reagan's ideas both by his supporters and his detractors, so it is a neutral term. Reaganomics is premised on the theory of trickle-down economics, which is a form of supply-side economics. And the idea of trickle-down economics is that if you want to stimulate the economy, you start by helping the people at the top, the wealth creators, the big companies, the big businesses, the ultra-rich, those who have lots of influence over the economy. Because no matter how much we want to beat up on the rich, beat up on the big faceless corporation, the fact is those entities and people have a lot of influence over the economy. Companies like General Motors or Wells Fargo or Shell Oil, these companies have tremendous influence. They create jobs, they generate a lot of wealth, a lot of people depend on them. So according to trickle-down economics, if you want to generate jobs for average Americans, what you have to do is cut taxes for the biggest corporations and the wealthiest people. And what those corporations and people will do with their money once you cut their taxes, they're now going to have extra money. What they're going to do is reinvest it in their business ventures. If you let, for example, if you let ExxonMobil keep more of its money each year, it's going to reinvest that into its business to grow its business. And as the rich and as these companies invest their money in business growth, that's going to result in new jobs created, which is going to make more opportunity for average Americans to work. So the benefits that you heap on the top most segment of the economic pyramid are going to trickle down to the lower levels. Now, so that's the basic idea. This today is a very staple idea of modern conservatism, but it wasn't always so. The Republican Party did not always embrace the idea of trickle-down economics. In fact, before George H.W. Bush was brought on to be Ronald Reagan's vice president, he had derided the concept of Reaganomics and called it voodoo economics. But of course, Bush would later become Reagan's vice president. Reagan would win and he would implement these policies. And so what did he do? Well, the top tax rates were cut from 70% down to 28%. That was the individual rates. And the corporate rates were cut from about 48% to 34%. So these are drastic tax cuts. He did cut domestic spending to social programs drastically, and he did cut regulation across the economy, especially in the industries of oil and gasoline, but also television, telephone, and banking and finance. The idea being, of course, that if these businesses didn't have to deal with so much cumbersome regulation, they could focus more on just making money and creating jobs. So these policies were pursued throughout the 80s through Reagan's 2 terms. And what were the results? Well, it's really a mixed bag, and it's hard to get an objective assessment of Reaganomics because since Reaganomics is still an economic theory that people are proposing today, a lot of times when people are arguing about Reaganomics, they're not talking about the history of the 1980s. They're really trying to make a political argument about what should be happening today. But forget about today. Let's just look at what did happen in the 80s. It was a mixed bag. The cuts in government spending to domestic programs left the government with a lot more money, a lot more money left over. So, for example, in 1988, the last year of Reagan's presidency, the government took in $909 billion, compared to 1980 when it only took in $517 billion. So that's almost $400 billion more dollars that the government was able to keep because they weren't spending that on social programs. However, this savings was offset by vastly increased military spending. Remember, another pillar of Reaganomics was increasing military spending. This was part of his strategy to win the Cold War. So yes, even though the government saved a lot of money, this was offset by the military spending, which still left the government in a deficit throughout Reagan's two terms in the 1980s. But then again, this helped bring the Cold War to a close, so you can question whether or not that was worth it. The inflation of the 70s was reduced. Unemployment fell to 6%, which is normal unemployment is around 5%, so this was much more tolerable than it was in the 70s and early 80s. And there was a period of economic prosperity. Everybody knows that the mid and late 80s were one of the most prosperous periods in American history, and there would be prolonged economic growth. 40 million new jobs created from 1982 to the year 2000. So it was one of the longest periods of economic prosperity in the 20th century. But despite that, wealth disparity grew, which means the gap between the rich and the poor. In other words, it's the often repeated mantra that the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. A lot of people got jobs, but the gaps between the rich and the poor grew. In other words, what this means is that the trickle did not reach all the way down to the lowest classes. Now, deregulation, cutting regulation, obviously helped this economic growth, but it also led to some reckless behavior, especially in the financial markets. Towards the end of the 1980s, there was a massive financial crash called the savings and loan crisis. Savings and loans were these small independent banks that issued mortgages and received savings deposits and whatnot. Now, they had some problems going back to the late 70s, but under Reaganomics, the regulation was slashed, and so they didn't have a lot of government oversight. And so what a lot of these savings and loan institutions did was got engaged in reckless investment, very similar to what happened in the 2008 financial crash. They made a lot of speculative, risky, rash investments with their clients' money, and these turned out to be horrible investments, and the savings and loan banks started failing. So many that through the early 90s, I think about 1/3 of all the savings and loans institutions failed and had to be liquidated, and this led into a mini recession at the beginning of the 90s. So yeah, there were consequences. So yeah, Reaganomics, mixed bag. Yeah, definitely a mixed bag, and it's okay. We don't have to be partisan about it. It's okay to say that some of Reagan's policies were a mixed bag, because we got to remember when we're evaluating history, we have to try to divorce our opinions of what we're studying from their modern applications today. Just look at what happened, and yeah, mixed bag, like so much else in history.